Today I'm going to talk about the auto ISO for your Olympus cameras. So basically there are two different auto ISO systems for the Olympus cameras, and it's a pretty handy feature, I think, to use when the lighting is constantly changing. And of the two systems, there's a basic one and then there's one that's a little more advanced. The basic one I found in my Olympus EM10 Mark II, and then I found a little more advanced one in my Olympus Pen F and EM1 Mark II. And I'll talk about the differences between the two and then how you can change some of the settings so that you can get better pictures or get a little bit more of what you're expecting in terms of your final image. Because auto ISO, as you know, basically what it's trying to do is get the correct exposure by changing the ISO setting in your camera automatically. And but as you know, that exposure is not only ISO, it's also shutter speed and aperture or your f-stops. So most people, they shoot in either aperture priority or shutter priority when they're using auto ISO. Because if you're in program mode, generally, you just want the camera to do everything in terms of exposure, so all you have to do is focus on composition. And then when you're in manual mode, you basically want control over everything, so you're not going to be using auto ISO that much. Although there are some people that do want auto ISO in manual. But I'm just going to talk about today the settings and how auto ISO behaves in aperture priority and in shutter priority. Okay, so let me just check my notes here so I don't get too distracted. Basically, okay, so let's start with the OMD EM10 Mark II, and I'm going to turn this on. And I've already done a full factory reset, so we can kind of be on the same page in terms of the settings. But the auto ISO feature by default is on. You can see it right here. ISO in the super control panel is set to auto. And as you can see, I'm just pointing my camera here at this light. That's a little bit off camera. But you can see that the ISO is running at 200, the shutter speed is at 3/20th of a second, and I have my f-stop set to f5.6, and I'm using today my kit lens on the EM10. So let's go into the menu and look at how you can change some of the settings for the auto ISO, because there are some presets already set. So let me go into the menu, and you just scroll down to the custom menu, and then you go down here to E, which is exposure, right? And you'll see it says ISO here as well. And then I just need to scroll all the way down here, and you can see this ISO is set to auto, which is the same thing that's on your super control panel, just in a outline format. But let's go to ISO auto set. And the default settings are a high limit of 1600 and a default limit of 200. Okay? And that's fine. And let's look at this ISO auto, this next thing. Basically what this is telling you is you can use auto ISO when you're P, A, or S. But if you want to use it in manual mode as well, you just set this to all, so it's going to work in P, A, S, and M. But we can leave this in PAS as default. Now back here to ISO auto set. Me personally, I like to move this up to about 6400. Okay, and then I'll leave the default at 200. But I'll explain why I change that sometimes. Sometimes I just leave it at 1600. But know right now that the auto ISO is going to start at 200 and then cap at 1600 when it's trying to change the ISO. But when does it decide to change the ISO? I mean, let's go into aperture priority and just sort of demonstrate that. Actually, I'm already in aperture priority. Basically, what auto ISO is trying to do is keep the ISO as low as possible, and then in this case change the shutter speed until it can no longer until it's forced to basically raise the ISO. But at what shutter speed does it decide that, okay, now it's time to start raising ISO because the shutter speed's too slow? And that's easy to find, and I'll just tell you it's 1/60th of a second. But watch, as I'm raising the f-stop, you can see the ISO is not changing, right? Because it's trying to maintain this ISO 200, but you can see the shutter speed is slowing down. And now I'm at f10, f11, I'm at f13, now I'm at f14, 1/60th of a second, and you can see that it just touched the ISO a little bit and raised it to 250. And if I go higher, now I'm at 320, I'm at ISO 400, and at f22, I've reached ISO 640 at 1/60th of a second. And I haven't hit that limit of 1600 ISO. So I was curious to see what happens if once we hit that limit at 1600, because the default floor on the shutter speed seems to be 1/60th of a second, but it does break that floor or go through that floor once you hit ISO 1600. So let's say you go, you're out in the sunny area, but then you move into some shade or a cloud comes over, you can see the ISO is going up, right? I'm at 1000 now. Now I've hit the 1600. Look what happened. It dropped down to 1/50th of a second. And as I take away more light, the shutter speed continues to drop, but the ISO is capped at 1600, so it has no choice but to increase the shutter speed. And you can see now we're at 40 seconds. And that's really one of the challenges with using auto ISO, is when the shutter speed is forced to drop below 1/60th of a second. And depending on what you're shooting, that may be okay. If you're shooting generally static shots like a landscape and you're on a tripod, under 1/60th of a second, maybe under 1/30th of a second, you're pretty much going to get a shake-free picture. IBIS and everything else aside, image stabilization, you're pretty much going to get a sharp picture at 1/60th of a second. So that's why Olympus decided to set the floor artificially to 1/60th of a second, and only break that floor once we've capped out the ISO at 1600. And I think, for most photography that's fine, but let's say you want to shoot some action. Maybe it's little kids or animals running around. In my case, I like to go to the dog park and shoot my dog running around the park with a bunch of dogs. And speak of the devil, she's coming down now. But anyway, 1/60th of a shutter speed is just not gonna cut it. I found that I really need to be at 1/1000th of a second, and using auto ISO in this case just doesn't make any sense in Aperture Priority. So what I'll do is I will change to Shutter Priority, and then just change my shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second. And you can see as I was doing that, watch the lens aperture is at f5.6. You can see that it's opening the lens up wider to f3.5, and f3.5 on this lens is the limit, as wide as it'll go. And you can see it bumped the aperture up, or I'm sorry, the ISO up to about 250. So now I can shoot fast action like my dogs at the park and use auto ISO, because sometimes the light drops a little bit. They're running in a sunny area, but then a cloud comes over. I know I'll still be at 1/1000th of a second, but now the camera has automatically bumped the ISO for me, so I can still get the proper exposure. It's not going to come out too dark or too bright, what have you. And this is really the only time I changed the ISO to more than over 1600 in the menu. So let's go in there, and I'll bump this to say 6400 when I'm doing fast action type things, because I'd rather have a sharp frozen picture, freezing the action with a little bit of grain, than have a blurry picture with no grain for action. So that might be one of the reasons you want to change the auto ISO or shoot in shutter priority versus shooting in aperture priority. Aperture priority generally is for creative effects, for depth of field, getting things in focus for landscapes. And then shutter priority, I would use that more for action type shots. You might be just in a situation where you just want to shoot kids, running around, or people moving around and dancing. And I think for that, you can probably, stay at 1/6400. But for that, you can probably use a shutter speed of, say, 1/250th for a little bit faster moving objects of people. But that's your choice, okay? And that's something you have to kind of experiment and get a feel for what shutter speeds work for different kinds of things. And there's charts and everything out there, but there's nothing like going out and just practicing and seeing what works for you and your camera. Okay, so that's basically it for the basic system. Now let me talk about the little bit more advanced system that I found in my Pen F. And I think it came actually with one of the firmware updates. So if you don't see this on your Pen F, make sure you have the latest firmware. Or if you're using the Olympus EM10, EM1 Mark II, with the latest firmware, it also has that, has the more advanced. And I'm using my 75-300 because it's going to illustrate a little better what the advanced features do. Because it has the same basic auto ISO system as the Olympus, but it also takes into account the focal length of the lens. And the reason you need to do that is when you're using longer focal lengths, say 100 millimeter, 200 millimeter, you need to set the shutter speed even higher to freeze the frame and try to minimize camera shake. And again, IBIS aside, when you're using longer focal lengths, it's more conducive to getting camera shake, like with your hands, right? So that's a nice thing about this. So let's see. Right now, we're at f5.6, ISO 200, and I'll just double check. I am in auto ISO. Okay, so let's see what happens as the light starts to drop. And the lens right now is set to 75 millimeters. As you can see, it doesn't really start to raise the ISO until we get to about 1/125th of a second. And let me demonstrate that by raising the aperture as well. Look at that, see? I'm at 1/60th of a second, I'm still at ISO 200. But as soon as I go below 1/60th of a second, you can see now it's starting to raise the ISO. And if you remember on the EM10, that shutter speed floor was at 1/60th of a second before it started raising ISO. But because I'm using a longer focal length, it's taking that into account and changing the shutter speed when I get to 1/60th of a second rather than waiting till we get to 1/60th. And let me go back to f5.6 and let me increase the aperture, or I'm sorry, the focal length to 300 and see if that makes any difference. And if I remember correctly, it did, because as I raised the shutter speed, you see I'm still at ISO 200. And now, as soon as I get down to 1/250th of a second, you can see the ISO bumped up a little bit to 250. Let me go back down a little bit. I'm at ISO 200, then at f9, I'm at 1/250th of a second, and it bumped the ISO just slightly. And then as I go up, it's going to try and maintain that 1/250th of a second all the way until I hit the bumper at ISO 1600. And since I can't really go any slower on this lens at f22, I'll just simulate maybe cloud cover coming in. As you can see, now the shutter speed is starting to drop because I've hit the ceiling of 1600 ISO. And again, this is where I would probably set the ceiling of the ISO to say 6400 for most of my photography. And I like that the more advanced system also takes into account the lens focal length, because if I were to put this lens on the EM10, it doesn't do that. It still has the same floor of 1/60th of a second, which is way too slow for this lens to get sharp pictures. Okay, but in addition to accounting for focal length, the more advanced auto ISO system, now going to the menu, has another feature. And it's in the same place. It's in the E menu, in the custom menu, right? So you just scroll down here, custom menu, scroll down to E for exposure. Then let's scroll down to auto ISO set. And it has the same upper limit and default, right? But it also has the lowest shutter speed setting. So the default is, I think, 1/250th of a second. I can tell the camera never go below 1/250th of a second. You know, set the floor there. Or I can tell it, yeah, it's okay to go down to even, 1/10th of a second, because I'm shooting a landscape or a static scene. Typically I might do this when, I'm taking multiple shots with a long telephoto lens and then merging them back together, but that's neither here nor there. Basically, this lowest SS or shutter speed setting is pretty handy, because what I usually use it for is I'll set the lowest shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second when I'm out taking pictures of my dog at the dog park. And then I can stay in aperture priority, because let's say I want to be at f8 all the time. I can stay in aperture priority and just let the camera control the ISO, because I fixed the shutter speed at 1/1000th as the floor. And I don't want it to go below that, because I know if I get an action shot of my dog jumping in the air, it's going to be blurry if I'm any slower than this. But let's see what happens again. If she runs into a cloudy area, it's going to bump the ISO up. But once I hit that 1600 ISO, even though I told the camera to be at 1/1000th of a second, it's going to break that floor and go even slower. So those same things kind of apply in terms of exposure. And again, that's why I like to raise the upper limit to 6400, just to give me that extra wiggle room or headroom on ISO. And with the logic being, a grainy sharp picture is better than a clear picture but it's blurry that doesn't have any noise. But that's basically it for auto ISO and how it behaves and how it affects shutter speed and aperture. Hopefully, you found this video helpful, and you'll start using auto ISO with that knowledge, so that you can get better pictures when you go out in the field for different types of scenarios. So again, thanks again for watching. Hopefully we'll see you again soon.